The rain came down hard that Tuesday evening on Route 9, somewhere between Millbrook and nowhere, and a 76-year-old woman sat alone in a stalled sedan with her hazard lights blinking like a heartbeat that didn't have much left in it. On the passenger seat beside her was a folder. Inside that folder was a letter from a bank. And inside that letter were 3 words that had been echoing in her chest all day long: vacate the premises. She had been turned away 3 times that day. By a mechanic who was closing up. By a neighbor who didn't want trouble. By a sheriff's deputy who told her he'd send someone when he could. Nobody came. The rain kept falling. And then she heard it. A deep, rolling thunder that had nothing to do with the sky. Chrome headlights cut through the dark. Engines growled like something ancient and untamed. And the last people on earth she expected pulled into that lot and stopped. The last person she expected stepped off his bike. And everything she thought she knew about fear was about to change. His name, according to the patch on his leather vest, was Caleb. But the town of Millbrook knew him by something else. They called him Grave. Not because he was looking for trouble, but because trouble had a way of going quiet when he walked into a room. Caleb Grave Mercer was 58 years old, a Vietnam veteran, full-patch member of the local Hells Angels chapter, and a man whose face looked like it had been carved from years of hard weather and harder choices. He had arms like bridge cable and a stare that made gas station clerks forget how to make change. He wasn't the kind of man who invited conversation. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to. When Caleb pulled into that diner parking lot on Route 9 and saw the old woman's hazard lights blinking in the rain, he didn't make a speech. He didn't ask for applause. He just walked over, knocked on her window twice, and said 4 words. Pop the hood for me. Her name was Eleanor Whitaker, 76 years old, widow of a Korean War veteran named Robert. She had lived in the same house in Millbrook for 52 years. She paid her taxes. She volunteered at the church. She baked bread for the neighbors after funerals and never once in her life had asked a soul for anything she didn't earn. But tonight she was sitting in a broken-down car in the rain with an eviction notice on the seat beside her, and she was trying very hard not to cry. When she heard the knock on her window and looked up into the face of a man in a Hells Angels patch, she felt the kind of fear that sits at the back of your throat. But she was also out of options. She rolled down the window. She looked at him, and she said the only thing she had left to say. No one else would help me. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He just nodded once and said, I know. Think about that for a second. Think about Eleanor sitting in that car, 76 years old, alone in the rain, holding an eviction notice, watching stranger after stranger drive past. How many people saw those hazard lights that night and kept going? How many people looked at that situation and decided it wasn't their problem? And now think about what it says that the one person who stopped, the one person who got off his bike in the rain and got his hands dirty under that hood, was the one everyone in town had already decided to be afraid of. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. Caleb found the problem in under 4 minutes. A busted coolant hose. He went back to his saddlebag, pulled out a strip of thermal tape and a spare clamp, because that's the kind of man he was, always prepared, always carrying what others might need. And he fixed it, right there in the rain. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for thanks. He just wiped his hands on a rag, looked at Eleanor, and said, Follow me into town. I'll make sure you get there. She followed him. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we tell on this channel, they are the kind you'll want to share. Now let's get back to Eleanor and Caleb, because what happens next in that diner is where this story really begins. They pulled into Millbrook around 8 p.m. Caleb walked Eleanor inside the Blue Ridge Diner, a narrow place with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee machine that hadn't been silent in 30 years. The moment the door opened and people saw the patch on Caleb's back, the room shifted. Conversations dropped. Forks paused midair. A couple in the corner booth looked at each other, grabbed their coats, and left without finishing their food. The waitress behind the counter, a young woman named Tricia, kept her eyes down and refilled the coffee pot 3 times without anyone asking. This was Millbrook. And in Millbrook, when Grave Mercer walked in, you either got small or got gone. But here's what nobody in that diner expected. Caleb didn't sit at the counter with his brothers. He pulled out the booth seat across from Eleanor and sat down. He ordered 2 coffees. And he listened. He listened the way men listen when they've learned that the world moves faster when you stay quiet. Eleanor told him everything. She told him about her husband Robert, who came back from Korea with a Purple Heart and a bad leg and never once complained about either. She told him how Robert built their house himself, board by board, over the course of 2 summers, and how every room in it still smelled like sawdust and memory. She told him how Robert died 4 years ago, and how the medical bills that followed chipped away at everything he had built, and how a developer had started calling 6 months after the funeral, offering to buy the property at a price that felt less like an offer and more like a threat. She had said no every time. And now the bank, under circumstances she still didn't fully understand, was moving to foreclose. The developer's name was Dawson Reed. Caleb's jaw went tight the moment he heard it. Not a dramatic reaction, not a scene, just a muscle in his jaw that tensed and stayed tense. Eleanor noticed. She stopped talking for a moment. "Do you know him?" she asked. Caleb looked at his coffee. "I know the name," he said, and left it at that. But that name was doing something to him on the inside that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Because Dawson Reed wasn't just a developer. He was a man with connections to the county permit office, the local zoning board, and a history of making problems disappear in ways that required money and silence in equal measure. He was also a man who had, over the past 3 years, positioned himself as a quiet sponsor of the Millbrook chapter's annual bike rally, donating enough to keep the event funded without ever showing his face at it. Which meant the club had history with Reed. Which meant touching Reed meant touching the club. And Caleb knew that better than anyone. He drove home that night slower than usual. The questions that were following him were the kind that don't let you sleep. Why did Reed want Eleanor's land badly enough to push a 76-year-old widow into foreclosure? What was he hiding underneath all those zoning filings and shell company names? And why? Why did Caleb's club president, Mac, I run horse Delaney, pull him aside just that morning and say, out of nowhere, "We don't get involved in civilian messes. Whatever you're thinking, Grave, don't." Caleb hadn't even told anyone about Eleanor yet. So how did Mac know something was coming? Let's talk about who these 2 people really were. Because this story doesn't work unless you understand what they were each carrying. Eleanor Whitaker was not a woman who asked for sympathy. She was the daughter of a coal miner, raised in a house where you worked hard, you prayed harder, and you didn't burden other people with your pain. She had spent her entire adult life being someone else's backbone, Robert's, her churches, her neighbors. The idea of needing rescuing was, to Eleanor, almost more painful than the foreclosure itself. The eviction notice wasn't just a legal document. It was a verdict on everything she had believed about working hard and playing fair and doing right by people. It was the world telling her that none of that had mattered. And the worst part? She was starting to believe it. Caleb Mercer was not a simple man. People in Millbrook had decided he was, because it was easier that way. It was easier to see the patch and the boots and the hard stare and call it a closed book. But Caleb had a story that most people in that town would never know. He enlisted at 19. He served 2 tours in Vietnam and came home to a country that didn't know what to do with men like him. He lost his younger brother, Danny, to a roadside accident 3 years after the war. A senseless, stupid accident on a wet road, the kind that doesn't mean anything and takes everything. He joined the Hells Angels not because he wanted power or chaos, but because for the first time since the army, he found himself surrounded by men who didn't flinch at who he was. Men who showed up. Men who stayed. Brotherhood, Real Brotherhood, was the only thing that had ever made sense to him in a world that mostly didn't. He had a code. He kept it, and part of that code was something he had never said out loud, but had always lived by. You don't leave the vulnerable to be eaten by the powerful. His mother had taught him that. She had been a woman who stood alone against the world for most of her life, and she had done it without breaking. Eleanor reminded him of her. More than reminded him, actually. It was something else. Something he couldn't name yet, but would. 3 days after Route 9, Caleb showed up at the club's Thursday night church meeting. The back room of Mac's garage. 12 men. Cigarette smoke and the smell of motor oil and old wood. Mac sat at the head of the table the way he always did. Still, controlled, with the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice because it never had to. He was 63, a bear of a man with iron gray hair and a scar along his jaw that he'd never explained to anyone. And he had led this chapter for 17 years through territory disputes, federal surveillance, member losses, and internal wars that would have shattered lesser men. Mac was not the enemy. That's what made this hard. Mac laid it out clean. Dawson Reed had just committed to a $50,000 sponsorship of the rally. It was the biggest donation the rally had ever received. It covered venues, insurance, security, and enough left over to fund their veterans outreach program for the year. We stay out of his business, Max said. That's the deal. He doesn't ask us for anything. We don't ask him for anything. Clean. He looked around the table. Looked at Caleb last. We clear. Everyone nodded. Except Caleb. He said, there's an old woman losing her home because of him. Silence. Mac didn't look surprised. Not our fight, he said. She's not one of ours. Her husband was a veteran, Caleb said. Mac looked at him a long time. I hear you. But you wear that patch. You don't freelance. You push this, you push us. And I won't have it. Caleb didn't say another word. He just sat with it. Let it sit in the room. He drove to Eleanor's that night. Her house was a white-clapboard place on Birch Creek Road with a porch swing that listed slightly to the left and a garden that had been lovelier before the knees gave out. Inside, it smelled like something home-baked and something old, the particular smell of a house that has been loved for decades by the same pair of hands. There were photographs on every wall. Robert in his uniform. Robert at their wedding, young and thin and grinning. Robert at the kitchen table, older, grayer, still grinning. On the mantel, a folded American flag in a triangle case. Beside it, a small framed citation. Caleb picked it up. He read it once. Set it back down. Read it again. The citation was from November 1950, during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. It described an action in which a sergeant from the 7th Infantry Regiment, Robert Allen Whitaker, had carried 2 wounded soldiers from a different unit out of a burning position under enemy fire, at significant personal risk, refusing to leave them despite orders to fall back. Both soldiers survived. Robert Whitaker was awarded the Silver Star. One of the soldiers listed in the citation had a name Caleb had not seen in decades, a name he carried in his chest like a stone. It was his brother's name. Not Danny, his brother who died in the accident. His other brother. His older brother, Thomas Mercer, who was listed as killed in action in Korea and whose death the family had never gotten a full accounting of. Except that according to this citation, Thomas Mercer had not died in that position. He had been pulled out alive by Robert Whitaker, and Caleb had never known. He stood in Eleanor's living room for a full 2 minutes without moving. Eleanor came in from the kitchen with a cup of tea and found him holding the frame. She saw his face. Are you all right? She asked. He turned to look at her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb Mercer didn't have anything to say. He sat down. He told her the name. He watched her face go through something complicated and quiet and deep. She set down the tea. She said, Robert talked about that night every year until the day he died. He said those were the 2 men he was most grateful to have saved. He always wondered if they made it home. She looked at Caleb. Did your brother make it home? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He did, he said. For a few more years, he did. They sat in that living room for a long time without talking. The kind of silence that means more than words. Loyalty, Caleb had always believed, was something you chose. You picked your brothers. You gave them your word. And your word meant everything, or it meant nothing. But what do you do when loyalty points in two directions? What do you do when the code you've lived by your whole life suddenly splits in half and asks you to choose which half of yourself to keep? Caleb chose. He walked back into church the following Thursday and said 7 words. I am helping her. That's my decision. The room went still the way rooms go still before something breaks. Mac looked at him for a long time. Nobody spoke. Then Max said, quietly, then you're on your own. And Caleb said, I know. And he meant it. He started by doing what he was good at, gathering intelligence. He spent 2 weeks pulling every publicly available zoning filing connected to Dawson Reed's shell companies. He found what he was looking for inside a 340-page environmental impact amendment buried in the county archives. Eleanor's property on Birch Creek Road sat directly inside the projected path of a federally funded highway expansion that had not yet been made public. The route had been quietly confirmed at the state level 8 months earlier. Any developer who knew about it and acquired the land before the public announcement stood to collect 4 to 5 times the purchase price in government compensation. Dawson Reed knew. He had known for almost a year. And he had spent that year using every legal and financial lever available to him to pressure Eleanor into selling or force her into foreclosure. This was not greed in a small, petty sense. This was premeditated. This was organized. And the more Caleb dug, the worse it got. How do you feel about that? A 76-year-old woman who spent 52 years in her home, who never asked for anything, whose husband won a Silver Star pulling soldiers out of the fire, being systematically pushed out of her own life by a man chasing a land deal. Think about the people who drove past her on Route 9 that night. Think about the sheriff who didn't stop. Think about the neighbor who didn't want trouble. And then think about what it took, what it actually cost, for one person to decide that her life was worth fighting for. Would you have stopped? Would you have gotten your hands dirty? I'm not asking rhetorically. I'm asking you to sit with that for a moment. Now here's where the story goes from bad to worse. Around the 3rd week of Caleb's investigation, he discovered something that made his stomach drop. Several of the shell company permit filings he had been tracing weren't just connected to Dawson Reed. They were connected to a series of zoning approvals that the Millbrook chapter had inadvertently facilitated years earlier, not through crime, but through relationships. A club member had a cousin in the permit office. Favors had been exchanged. Nothing that would hold up as criminal, but enough to make the club look like they had been unknowingly clearing a path for Reed's operation. If this went to court and the filings got subpoenaed, the club's name would be in the record. Mac's name would be in the record. And that was the thing that Reed was counting on. The thing that was supposed to guarantee the club stayed quiet. Caleb sat with this for one night. Just one. And then he made the call that cost him the most. He contacted a civil attorney in Allegheny County, a woman named Patricia Doyle who specialized in predatory foreclosures and municipal land abuse, and he hired her. He paid the retainer with the money from the sale of his custom-built 1971 Harley-Davidson FLH. That bike was the last physical thing his brother Danny had touched. Danny had helped him rebuild the engine the summer before the accident. Caleb had ridden it at the memorial. He had told himself he would never sell it. He sold it on a Tuesday morning and didn't let himself think about it for long enough to change his mind. If you've ever had to give up something that was the last piece of someone you loved, you know what that costs. It's not money. It doesn't matter how much money it is. It's the feeling that you're letting go of a hand you were still holding. Caleb let go, because Robert Whitaker had held on when he didn't have to, and the debt on that action was long overdue. The sheriff delivered a legal warning to Caleb's residence 10 days before the court hearing, a notice that he was potentially subject to a civil harassment injunction if he continued pressuring Reed's business associates. The club received a letter from Reed's attorneys the same week, citing their historical business relationship and requesting they manage their members. Mac called a vote. It was close, but the result was what Caleb had feared: temporary suspension. He turned in his patch on a Wednesday evening, handed it to Mac without ceremony. Mac took it. Their eyes held for a second. Neither of them said a word. Caleb drove home without it for the first time in 23 years. The morning of the court hearing, Millbrook showed up. Not for Eleanor. Not for Caleb. They showed up the way people show up when they expect a spectacle. Reed's attorneys were there in $2,000 suits. The bank's representative sat behind them with a folder full of documents and an expression that suggested he had done this 100 times and expected to do it 100 more. Eleanor sat at the plaintiff's table in a blue dress she had last worn to a church fundraiser, with her hands folded in front of her like a woman in prayer. Patricia Doyle sat beside her, and Caleb sat one row back, in a plain gray flannel shirt, no patch, no colors. Just a man in a room, sitting with an old woman who had no one else. The hearing started at 9. Reed's attorneys opened with a clean, efficient presentation. Mortgage default, missed payments, standard procedure. Nothing unusual, nothing to contest. Patricia Doyle listened to all of it, and then, when it was her turn, she stood up and placed a 3-inch binder on the judge's bench. Inside that binder was everything. The highway expansion route, the pre-announcement acquisition strategy, the shell companies, the permit filings, the timeline that proved Reed had known about the federal contract before he made his first offer to Eleanor and had used that knowledge to deliberately engineer her financial distress. And on the final page, a letter from the Federal Highway Administration confirming that the acquisition of Eleanor's property would be subject to federal protections under the Veterans Heritage Land Preservation Act, a statute protecting the homesteads of decorated combat veterans from compelled displacement. The room went quiet, but then the doors in the back opened. Every head in the courtroom turned, and standing in that doorway, in full colors, was Mac, Iron Horse Delaney. Behind him, 11 more members of the Millbrook chapter. Full patch, dress cuts. They walked in without a word and filled the back 2 rows. Mac looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Mac. And Mac said, loud enough for the room to hear, "We don't abandon our own. And anyone he stands for stands with us." He held up a second folder. Inside it was documentation the club had pulled independently, bank communications, text messages obtained through a contact, and a financial trail connecting Reed directly to fraudulent real estate transactions in 3 other Pennsylvania counties. It wasn't just a land grab. It was a pattern, and they had proved it. Dawson Reed was arrested before he got out of his chair. The judge halted the foreclosure proceedings within the hour. The Federal Highway Administration was notified. A federal investigation was opened. And under the Veterans Heritage Land Preservation Act, Eleanor Whitaker's home on Birch Creek Road was placed under a protection order that would take a congressional act to reverse. Eleanor didn't shout. She didn't jump up. She sat very still and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, the way people look when they're trying to hold something inside that's too big to hold. Then she let out a breath she had been holding for a year. And then she cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way women cry when they've been strong for too long. Caleb reached forward from the row behind her and put his hand on her shoulder once. Just once. After the hearing, outside on the courthouse steps, Eleanor found Caleb standing alone. The rest of the club had moved off to give them space. She came and stood beside him. The sun was actually out for the first time in what felt like weeks. She looked up at him and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. "I never had children," she said. "Robert and I, we tried. It just wasn't in the cards." She paused. "I've been alone in that house for 4 years. And I had started to think that was just what the rest of my life was going to be. Just alone." She looked at him steadily. "But you came. And then they came." She gestured toward the club. "And I don't know how to thank a person for that. I don't know that there's a word for it." Caleb was quiet. Then she said the thing that broke him open completely, not in a loud way, but in the deep, permanent way that only happens when the truest thing you've needed to hear finally arrives. She looked at him and said, "You do now? You have a family now." And then, Because Eleanor Whitaker was not a woman who did things halfway. She reached up, put both arms around him, and held on. Caleb stood very still for a moment. Then he put his arms around her too. Mac returned Caleb's patch at the clubhouse that Friday. No ceremony. He just set it on the table in front of him and said, "You were right. We were wrong to stay quiet as long as we did. That won't happen again." That was all. With men like Mac, that was everything. The chapter spent the following month helping Eleanor renovate the parts of her house that had fallen into disrepair during the years of financial stress. New porch boards, a repaired roof section, a kitchen ceiling that had been leaking since the fall. They didn't make a project of it. They just showed up on Saturdays and worked. And Eleanor made enough coffee to supply a small army and asked them all questions about their lives and remembered the answers, because that's who she was. Caleb rode out to Birch Creek Road every few weeks after that. He never stayed long. He'd check on the house, sit on the porch with a coffee, let Eleanor talk about Robert. And she'd ask him about Danny, about Thomas, about the things he carried. And he'd answer, not all at once, but a little at a time. The way men like Caleb answer, slowly, carefully, like they're deciding with each word whether it's safe to keep going. And it was safe. There's something this story asks of every person who hears it. Not just whether Caleb did the right thing, though that's worth asking, but something deeper. It asks you what you're doing with the debts you carry. The ones that nobody handed you a bill for, but you know you owe. The ones where somebody once stood in the fire for your family and you never got the chance to pay it back. Eleanor's husband saved 2 men from a burning position in Korea and never asked for anything in return. And 70 years later, on a rainy highway outside a small town, that debt came back around. Not because the world is fair. The world is not fair. But because some men, some rare, stubborn, code-driven men, refuse to let a debt go unpaid when they finally find out they owe it. Reputation isn't character. A patch isn't a person. And brotherhood, real brotherhood, isn't blind loyalty to whoever happens to be standing beside you. It's the willingness to stand up when it costs you something, when it costs you everything, and to do it anyway because the alternative is becoming someone you can't live with. Caleb Mercer was afraid of very few things in his life, but the one thing he feared more than any fight, any rival, any threat, was becoming a man who walked past a broken-down car in the rain and kept going. He didn't keep going. And because of that, an old woman is sitting on her porch right now, in the house her husband built with his own hands, watching the light change through the trees her husband planted, with a reason to believe the world still has men in it worth trusting.